Hello again. Welcome you back to the lessons on professionalism in interpreting and translation. Let's come to module number 12, degrees of revision. Here on the screen you can see the outline for the whole lesson. We are going to talk about the need for revision by a second translator. And then we want to determine the degree of revision, like which parameters will be tracked, which level of accuracy and writing quality is required, whether or not to do full or partial checking, compare or reread. And then we are going to learn about some consequences of less than full revision, as well as the relative importance of transfer and language parameters. And the last discussion is on a good enough approach to revision. To revise or not to revise, that is the question to be considered in this chapter. Will a translation be looked at by a second translator? And if so, will the entire text be revised or just part of it? Will it be compared to the source text or be reread without comparison? Will all parameters be tracked or just one? If you look hard enough, you'll always be able to find more things to change. Imagine that you are taking a final glance through a lengthy English translation to your author. You notice that some subheadings have all words capitalized, while some have only the first word capitalized. Does this mean that quality control has failed, and that you should immediately set about making the capitalization persistent? No. The question is, just how important was it to catch this problem? With one text, it may be very important, but with another one, not important at all. Many readers may not notice, and even if some do, it may not create a bad impression in the case of a relatively ephemeral text, one which will be read by only a few people within the organization for information purposes, and then discarded. Tolerance for errors, awkward writing, even minor mistranslations varies with the type of the text. It may also vary with urgency. The client will prefer to have an awkwardly worded document before the meeting at which it will be used than a beautifully worded document after the meeting. And as we saw in chapter 1, there are many things that can go wrong when writing or translating. And consequently, there is a very long list of things you might track or not. And in this chapter, we are going to look at how to determine the degree to which you would revise a text and the consequences of less than full revision. Here in the section 1, the need for revision by a second translator. Having a second translator look over a translation is costly, especially if a comparison is made with every sentence of the source text and all parameters are taken into consideration. We have 14 parameters, right? Such revision work is usually done by a senior, more highly paid translator, and every minute devoted to revising someone else's translation is a minute not devoted to preparing a new translation. A second look becomes time-wasting and therefore even more costly if the reviser has been properly trained or makes large numbers of unnecessary changes. The whole exercise becomes largely pointless if the reviser misses many significant errors, and becomes positively helpful if the reviser introduces errors. And there is some reason to believe that these things happen with alarming frequency. So, the predominant view, as expressed in the policies of translation services and agencies and surveys of translators, is that not every text requires a second look, and that even when it is required, the revision can sometimes be partial, less than the entire text is examined. Need not be comparative. That is, a simple reading of the translation is enough, is sufficient, and need not cover all parameters. So, this one is a predominant view. Okay, expressed in the policies of many translation services, agencies, and through the surveys of translators. Not every text requires a second look, and even when we have to have a second look for an entire text, the revision can sometimes be partial. There's no need to be comparative, and it need not cover all parameters. It should be noted that the actual practices may vary from policy. Interviews with revisers show that it is not always practical to do everything that policy requires, usually for the lack of time or non-availability of staff personnel, or the opposite. The policy calls for less tricking than revisers think is necessary. Then they may then ignore the policy. Some translation services and agencies emphasize tracking certain micro aspects of a translation where errors will be immediately visible to the clients, like spelling, grammar, punctuation, client-specific terminology. However, the reviser may not actually follow these preferences strictly, and instead they devote quite a lot of time to readability. That is because professional translators tend to see this as important regardless of any policy. So, how is the decision made about whether to have a text revised by a second translator? Here is a table summarizing the revision philosophy at the OECD, or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, as set out by two of their translation service revisers. Bear in mind that such policies may not work in particular instances because clients impose unrealistic deadlines, or because demand increase, that there is no corresponding increase in the number of available in-house or contract learners, contract translators. So you can see this one is just like a magic. Based on the reliability of the translator, whether or not he or she is highly reliable, or with good reliability, or fairly reliable, or poorly reliable, and based on the importance of the text given, whether or not it is of high importance, medium importance, and low importance, we can make decision on the degree, the degree or the level of revision by a second translator. If the text is highly important and the translator is a poor reliability, of course you should retranslate. much revision is needed and even retranslate the text. However, if the text is of very low importance and the text is translated by a highly reliable translator, then there is no need to do the revision like this one. So you see that in this approach, the need for revision by a second translator is based on the risk of negative consequences if errors are not found. Risk is seen as a function of the importance of the text and reliability of the translator. Number 0 here represents very low risk or even no risk, whereas number 5 very high risk. As can be seen, the main factor is the importance of the text. The top line on the chart representing text of high importance. So as can be seen, the main factor is the importance of the text. The top line on the chart representing the text of high importance is only one where the risk ever rises above 3, even with a translator of poor reliability. Revision is not seen as essential, only recommended. With text of low importance, and even with high importance text, if the translator is highly reliable, revision is only recommended, not important or essential, and it takes the form of rereading the translation rather than comparing it with the source. This system assumes that the identity of the translator is known, something which is not always the case with outsourced materials. Translation services and agencies often have lists of text types which are deemed to be of high importance. Typically, this will include laws and regulations, documents in which errors could have negative health and safety implications, and documents in which errors could harm the image or reputation of the corporation or government which has commissioned the translation. Translations that are for information only, not publications, will have medium or low importance, though they may still require revision by a second translator if the drafting translator were inexperienced as a translator or in the field of a text. In addition, translations supplied by contractors will need to be tracked to at least some degree in order to determine whether the work is satisfactory before payment is made. Finally, clients may specifically request a full comparative revision by a second translator, though they may have to pay a higher price for this service. For self-employed translators, the key factors in deciding whether to have a second translator take a look at self-confidence. Are you confident in your own translation, or do you feel a little bit uncertain about it? Of course, one can be overconfident, especially if one has years of experience. It is therefore probably a good idea to have your work looked at occasionally, but you will need to find someone with an equal or preferable higher level of subject matter knowledge. Now, we're going to come to section 2 of this module, determining the degree of revision. In professional work, one doesn't have all the time in the world. The client is expecting the revised text by a date which is often not far off. You, the translation service you work for, maybe must therefore consider whether you are going to do a time-consuming full comparative revision of the text. checking for problems in all 5 groups of parameters discussed in Chapter 11, like transfer, content, language, presentation, and specifications. If you have several jobs going at once, you must also consider whether they all merit equal attention. Better to devote the available hours to the text which merits more work. There is not much point in spending vast amount of time on the stylistic editing of a text which is relatively ephemeral. If you do a less than full revision of this text, you will have more time for a full revision of text that merits. Those which have to be read by many people over a long period of time, or by people outside the organization, or possibly by a few highly placed people who may get an unfavorable impression of the translation service if they find errors. Here are the choices available to you, expressed in the form of questions. Shall I check 1, 2, 3, or 4 or 5 groups of parameters? 2. Within each group, shall I examine all parameters or just some of them? Within transfer, for example, you might decide to focus on completeness. Within language, you might decide to focus on smoothness. And within specification, you might decide to focus on the use of client-specified documentation only. Question 3. What overall degree of accuracy and writing quality should I aim at? Question 4 is, shall I check the entire text or just parts of it? Question 5. Shall I compare the translation to the source text or just glance at the source text as the need arises? And the last question is, which degree of consistency shall I enforce and for which aspects of the text? So, for this one, now let's move to the very first discussions in this second section. The first one is, which parameters will be tracked, right? How will you decide which parameter to track? And here are some of the factors, again expressed as questions. A. Who will be the reader of the translation? Who will read the translation? With some types of reader, it may be important to pay special attention to tailoring. Readers who are not experts in the field of the text, or those with less than secondary education, immigrants still learning the target language, and readers in other countries who are not native speakers of the target language. If people outside the commissioning organization will be reading the translation, that is a publication, then all parameters become more important. If the author of the source is likely to read the translation, it may sometimes be necessary to cater to this person by checking that the translation is not only accurate, but also as close as possible to the source in terms of syntactic, structure, and correspondence of vocabulary items, though obviously there are limits to this. Similarly, another question is B. Why will the translation be read? If some of the readers are going to make a decision based partly or entirely on the content of the translation, then transfer and content are more important than the other parameters. If the translation will have a readership consisting of a single person who will use this as a source information for writing a further document in that field, then it may not be necessary to track sub-language or terminology. Readers who are subject experts will know the right terms as long as the ideas have been correctly conveyed. Question C. For how long will the translation be read? If the text will probably still have readers many years hence, then it is worth looking up all the parameters and being fussy about consistency. If the text is ephemeral, there is no point in worrying about presentation. Question D. How will the translation be read? Will the readers skim through it quickly, or will some of them read very carefully and possibly reread? Skimming will be easier if the text is highly readable, in the sense of having good inter-sentence connections and plenty of structural signposts. Careful readers will be disturbed by logical problems that may not be obvious on a quick first reading. That is, a contradiction between two successive sentences, or a use of therefore where there's no cause and effect. Okay? And if the text is a manual for consultation, that is, it will not be read from start to finish, then you must ensure that each section is understandable on its own and doesn't require a knowledge of the preceding sentences. If the translation will be read aloud, for example, it is a speech or repair instructions that will be read aloud to the person who is performing the repair, then smoothing will be especially important. Question E. Where will the translation be read? Will it appear in a book, a manual for consultation while doing something else, on a web page, or on signage? The issue here is whether the reader will be sitting in a quiet environment as they read, or will they be consulting the text in a busy environment with many distractions, perhaps performing some other task as they read, or walk past a translated sign, or reading their smartphone screen as they amble down the street. In these cases, brevity and simplicity of language will be actually important. And question F. Am I familiar with the work of this translator? If you have looked at the translator's work before, you know the kinds of errors they are prone to. If you are self-revising, then you will hopefully know the kinds of errors likely to be present in the draft. Question G. Is the deadline tight? If the translator was rushing to meet the deadline and the reviser was also rushed, then pick just one or two parameters, perhaps accuracy and completeness, or sub-language. That is the terminology. And the last question here is 8. Will anyone else be quality controlling this translation? If a proofreader will be looking at your revised translation, then you can ignore how style sheet matters and the presentation parameter except for those aspects directly related to the meaning. So, determining which parameter to check for is a matter of experience and common sense. Theoretically, one could attempt to set up a complicated system based on the above 8 questions from A to H about user and use. Such a system would tell you that if the answer to the first question is such and such, and the answer to the second question is such, and so on, for the questions, then quality control should consist of spot checking for language and presentation parameters. However, in the absence of any empirical evidence that a given degree of revision is best suited to a particular answer to the 8 questions, such a complicated approach seems pointless. Knowing the answer to question A to E amounts to knowing the brief. Before you revise someone else's translation, it is vital that you know at least the answers to the question A and B. Who are the readers and why will they be reading the translation? Okay, so here is a chart showing the OECD's policy on which parameters to track. As can be seen, the decision about which parameters to check depends primarily on the importance of the text. The letter H means that there is a high requirement to eliminate problems, whereas the letter L represents a low requirement. In other words, undiscovered problems related to the matter can be tolerated. Thus, errors in terminology can be tolerated in medium and low importance text, and as can a few additions or omissions or insignificant meaning elements. As for writing style, it receives no attention at all in low important text. Problems with accuracy, on the other hand, require careful attention at all levels of importance. Bear in mind that this policy is being applied to the particular type of text that is translated at the OECD. For example, it seems that the audience of the translation always consists of the same type of individuals and the audience of the source, so tailoring to a different audience is not an issue. Now, what level of accuracy and writing quality is required? Let's look in more detail at the first 4 degrees of writing quality. So, let's look in more detail at the first 4 combinations of accuracy and writing quality requirements. For intelligible level, depending on the users and the use of the translation, you may be aiming for a revised translation which makes sense but has a bare minimum of readability, may contain incorrect language, and is only roughly accurate. It will not seriously mislead or mystify the reader about primary elements of the message of the source text. There may be question marks in the final product indicating passages where meaning remains uncertain because you decided that additional research were not worthwhile. At this level, there is no point applying house style rules worrying about presentation, creating unidiomatic expressions, or creating even text internal consistency, never mind consistency with other kind of text. Post-editing of machine translation output may aim at this level. In some situations, it may also be the level expected of translators, who occasionally produce translations into their second language, which are not going to be published. The second level is informative. At this level, the final product avoids misleading the reader about primary and perhaps secondary elements of the message of the source text. It need not be more than fairly readable and mostly correct. This is suitable for translations that will not be published, or for less important published texts, or for text required urgently. If you're revising the first draft of a document, there's no point in creating a nice, smooth version of a sentence which may later be deleted or completely altered. At this level, do not spend a lot of time on writing quality, consistency, or presentation, and perhaps do not bother with house style rules. The third level is publishable. The final translation is fully accurate with respect to primary, secondary, and perhaps other elements of meaning, and the language is fully correct, well tailored, and smooth. House style rules are applied. Presentation is tracked and curated, and a reasonable level of text internal consistency is sought. This level is suitable for more important texts, whether or not they are actually published. A clarification about publication is in order. A publication is to be understood as a document which will be available to an audience outside the organization which commissioned it. As the term suggests, it is a document for the public or some segment of the public. To put it another way, there is no such thing as an internal publication. An organization may well publish full-color documents on expensive paper that are distributed only in-house, but this glossiness doesn't touch documents into publications, as listed here. Polished is level number 4. At this level, the reading experience is in itself interesting and enjoyable, quite apart from the content. Creating such a finely crafted text can be extremely time-consuming, even if you are not aiming at that ultimate level of craftsmanship where you become the new Flaubert, rewriting 1,000 times until each sentence is just perfect. This level of writing may be sought when the glance image is at stake. You will also be aiming for this type of level if you are self-employed and your pricing strategy is to charge a high price and become known for exceptional writing quality, for example in commercial translation. Okay, so there are 4 levels of requirements in accuracy and writing quality. The next question for us to discuss is whether or not to do a full or partial checking. When you read the entire text or just parts of it. Rasmussen found in interviews with revisers that although a company's policy may be to always compare source and translation, the reviser do not necessarily perform a comparison for the entire text. Similarly, the revision manual of one Spanish department says that in principle the whole text must be revised, but in certain circumstances, the partial revision may do. So here are some of the possibilities on this question of how much to read. Full reading, spot check, scan, and glance. For full reading, read the translation in full. If you are checking for accuracy and completeness, compare each sentence to the source. Otherwise, do a unilingual rereading, that is, refer to the source only when a passage is questionable. When self-revising, you should always do at least a full unilingual reading. Spot check. What to do there? You read the title or the cover page and the first paragraph, and then read either at regular intervals or randomly selected paragraphs or pages spread over the entire text. Be sure to read passages at the end of the text since the translator may have been rushing to meet the tight deadline and so may have made more mistakes. Compare the selected passages to the original or just refer to the original when a passage is in question. Scan. Read the title and the cover page and the first paragraph. Then read by following your fingers across each page, focusing on just 1 or 2 parameters. Refer to the original when a passage is questionable. By glance, we read the title or the cover page, the first paragraph, and the last one. So we have some consequences of less than full revision. We have a kind of risk level because we are human, so mistakes are not, cannot be avoided, right? and types of errors are during partial revision and unilingual reading. The same danger arises with unilingual rereading. It can easily degenerate into proofreading in the sense of a hunt for errors in mechanics and presentation, like typos, wrong annotations, grammars, and the like. So now let's come to the questions of the relative importance of transfer and language parameters. Now let's move to some consequences of less than full revision. Acceptable risk. We are humans, so we can tolerate risk because mistakes are unavoidable, right? So look at this slide. We have some types of errors sought during partial revision and unilingual rereading. In addition to the problem of errors in passages that are not tracked, there is the problem of the type of errors sought in passages that are tracked. There is a great temptation when doing partial revision to devote one's time to looking for relative, superficial, and easy to spot errors. How satisfying to have found another case when and where the translator left a space between the last letter of a sentence and the period. But just how important a fight was this? It would have been better to notice the mistranslation in that sentence. Unfortunately, you cannot distract your mind to notice only serious errors. If you have time for only one read-through, you will see all kinds of errors. Still, perhaps you will notice more of the serious problems if you avoid adopting a mental sense that puts you on the lookout for relatively trivial problems. You try to become aware of whether you are spending a lot of time on relatively unimportant things. The same dangers arises with unilingual rereading. It can easily degenerate into proofreading in a sense of a hunt for errors in mechanics and presentation, like typos, wrong annotation, grammar mistakes, and the like. If you do spend most of your time searching for errors in presentation and mechanics, then you are definitely not earning your pay. This is work that can be done by a copy editor or a proofreader, whose time is probably much less expensive than yours. Your services as a reviser are required only if the quality control includes at least one of accuracy, completeness, logic, smoothness, tailoring, sub-language, idiom, and specification. So in many situations, you will have to check mechanics and presentation because there's no one else to do so. But if you are combining this with unilingual revision, make sure you are still reading for meaning. Ideally, you will proofread in a separate another step. We also come to another concept for some consequences of less than full revision or do a partial revision. We have to do a lot of research during revision. For example, junior translators could be asked to indicate their sources, and the experienced ones could be asked to put a check mark beside any passage where they believe you might have doubts to indicate that the translation, despite appearances, is correct. Now I want to walk you through to the next section of module number 12, the relative importance of transfer and language parameters. This chapter has been concerned with how the features of a particular translation shall determine the appropriate degree of revision. However, there is a factor that goes beyond the particular text at hand. Revision is traditionally thought of as being concerned with two things: accurate transfer and good writing in the target language. Now, the relative importance of these may vary, not just with the text, but with the general social historical situation in which the text translations is being done. For example, there have been times in history when accuracy was not deemed especially important, but what was important was to create a beautifully written text in the target language. The situation in Canada is interesting in that where accuracy is important, whether one is translating from English to French or in the opposite direction, things are different when it comes to the importance of language parameters. This is partly a matter of different attitudes toward language in the French and English-speaking worlds. In English, we have long accepted a more relaxed approach in non-literary writing, where language is seen as a means to an end, not something important in itself. In the French-speaking world, language has been valued more for itself, though this is now changing as the US cultural norms become ever more influential. In Quebec, however, there is an additional factor at work. To simplify somewhat, revision in Quebec has traditionally been first and foremost concerned with quality of French. The situation in English-speaking Canada is completely different. Only a very small number of what people read a translation, and people's speech and writing are hardly influenced by French. So we have the last term here, a good enough approach to translation revision. Good enough is a very difficult target that not all translators can accomplish, and it is an enormous improvement on the current situation. Good enough can sometimes be a kind of fit for purpose. If you are a self-employed translator and reviser, it is fine to make the translation perfectly done. And if you are doing other revision, you should take the goals of the first translator. Thank you. That is the end of this module.